Michel Barnier?
He's already said that, for example, one of the key things in this whole debate, which is freedom of movement, is not up for discussion. He said it can't be changed. Britain has to accept it, and that's the one thing that the British people are not going to accept.
But it doesn't. Now that Mrs May has said we're leaving the single market, the free movement's not a matter for debate.
Well, he's supposed to be negotiating our position, and I'd like.
No, he's supposed to be
negotiating their
position.
But in order to arrive at this mythical deal at the end of this long, protracted process, he said that freedom of movement's not up for negotiation. Mr Verhofstadt said it's not up for negotiation.
But it isn't a matter now. I mean, I'm not quite sure that freedom of movement was one of the 4 freedoms that comes with being a member of the single market. If we are now saying, rightly or wrongly, we are now saying we will not be a member of the single market because freedom of movement's not an issue.
Yes, but the issue about tariff-free trade is, and there is a solution to that problem.
But you weren't saying that. You were talking about freedom of movement.
But they're talking about that in order to sort out the trade issues, which is the big issue, probably the second biggest issue in the whole thing.
No, a free trade deal you can do. We do free trade deals, the European Union, the other countries, bilateral deals. They don't involve freedom of movement issues, as I would suggest. The EU-Canada deal, which is the latest one, has no freedom of movement implications. Is that right?
No, indeed. I mean, sometimes, of course, when Britain's tried to secure trade deals with countries like India, we have come a cropper on that issue. So, because the
Indians that's a visa issue.
Exactly.
That's a visa
but
issue.
I would just come back on one thing that was said when you said, the British people have decided that they don't want to have freedom of movement. Actually, most opinion polls show that even a majority of Leave voters said if there was a top-up between having access to trade across the EU and having some freedom of movement, they would prioritise that access to trade. But clearly, Theresa May has decided she wants to take us in a particular direction.
There will be some freedom of movement, and there will be some access to the single market. These are the issues that have to be negotiated. Yeah. Do we know anything yet? There's so many names there in Adam's film, all with their own constituencies. I don't mean that in a political sense, but their own interests in Brussels. Do we have any idea what the common line is going to be yet?
Well, I think ultimately the EU 27, whether we're talking about them represented in the EU institutions or in member states, they're wanting to ensure the best outcome for all of them. And that is one that has a good deal for Britain as well. But that will not happen if we keep having a kind of zero-sum politics. If we keep having this trade-off saying, oh, well, if we have a deal that works for the rest of the EU, it's not possibly going to work for Britain and vice versa.
Who's saying that?
Well, you've got, unfortunately, some political voices.
Yeah,
we've had those
Give me one.
Well, we've had the threats from Theresa May, for example, saying, oh, well, if we don't get that deal, then we're just going to turn ourselves into a bargain basement tax haven.
Well, no, the bargain basement's your party's phrase. She's never used that at all. What she said is that if we did come out on WTO rules, we would need to also consider our economic model. That doesn't. There are plenty of choices between being what we are now and Singapore, which isn't that much of a bargain.
Yeah, well, Philip Hammond has pushed the same line. They know exactly what they're saying. They're grown-ups. They know the kind of messages that they're sending, and I think they're deeply damaging ones when we should be building bridges rather than blowing them up, which is what they seem to be doing now.
Well, except that if you hear what's come out of Europe recently, I was listening to one of the Baltic state ministers this morning on another channel. He was much more conciliatory. Poland has been beginning to say the same. Even Michel Barnier has said he understands the importance of the London capital markets to the whole of the EU. But what I wanted to ask you is this. We have a rough idea, I put it no higher than that because of the white paper and Mrs May's Lancaster House speech, of the British government's negotiating position. Rough idea. Doesn't the European Union now need to give its equivalent of its rough idea?
Yes, that's a very good point. And of course, as I said, we're going to have these very long 2 years of protracted negotiations to end up in a position where we really should know where we want to be now, which is that we have freedom to make our own laws. We want to continue trading on tariff-free basis if possible. We can make that offer to them very easily. The people who, although the Parliament has a vote on this at the end, and these are the European Parliament could scupper the whole thing by voting against it, depending what it looks like. It's actually the Council that makes the decision to accept it or not by...
Yes, the Council of Ministers does that.
And I feel that they are going to come under, because they are the heads of government in their own countries, they're going to come under tremendous pressure from their own industries and businesses to actually reach a sensible agreement, rather than the ideologues in the European Parliament.
One thing that could scupper the negotiations, it would be if the EU insists on agreeing some kind of Brexit bill up front, whether it's 40 or 60 billion or whatever. Because I would suggest to you, no British government can agree to that.
Well, I mean, in an ideal world, would we be here at all? I mean, I can understand their thinking in talking about that. Actually, more recently, they've been saying they want to agree a methodology for deciding what the commitment would be rather than a figure. But of course, people extrapolate figures out of that immediately. So there's
What
not
would
a
it be?
big-
What would we
big
be
difference
paying
there.
for?
Just take one example, right? You can imagine, say, a Lithuanian civil servant, right, who joins the commission when she's 25, okay? Now, when she joined, the British state had a liability for part of her pension, okay, when she retires in 40, 50 years, whatever. Now, that's still going to be there in the future, you know, in the same way that the British state has got a liability for my pension when I've paid national insurance.
Sure, but you're not leaving the British state.
No, indeed.
I
but
mean,
it's
you are
these kinds
aware
of
that
issues.
Brussels pensions, the pensions of Brussels bureaucrats, are between 2 and 3 times average earnings in Britain. You think the British
absolutely.
people are going to stand for that? That they are paying for pensions that are up to 3 times their average wage?
No, I agree with you. There's going to be difficult discussions about that. What I worry about, though, is if this just gets turned into something about bashing quite a small number of people, essentially, and we're talking about small amounts of money in comparison to the overall amount we could
Well, 60
lose in
billion
trade
it is.
deals, in comparison to the amount we could lose in trade deals. I'm not saying it's peanuts, a lot of money, but in comparison to what we could lose, you know, we need to look at these issues with an adult head on our shoulders.
Okay, what would you say to the demand, if that is what it is, for a divorce bill?
Well, what the EU is going to do, what everybody else in the world has to do, is when their income drops, they have to also reduce their outgoings. There will be people who've got pension liabilities or whatever, but I think that will be fairly minimal, and the governments can get agree between them how to deal with that, where obligations to particular people who've been working for a lifetime or whatever. But the idea of giving, Mr Verhofstadt has proposed, that we give actually billions of pounds in order to pay for our membership up until 2020, the end of the current budget period, is pure fantasy. It's not
very
going,
briefly.
It's not going to happen, and it shouldn't happen.
But there are a lot of things that you and the Leave campaign promised we'd keep getting, like the research funds, like, you know, various other streams of money that we were told we would still get. Now, the money for that potentially has got to come from somewhere.
It's our
And
taxpayers'
that
money
has been
anyway, and the
promised
research
to us.
funds is quite a small proportion. The government could easily make that up in this
It's
country.
pretty
Well, we
important
shall
for-
see. There's plenty of time to debate this in the weeks
Sorry.
and months ahead, I fear.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.